Nebraska poet Twyla Hansen once wrote in a poem she called Midwestern Autumn these lines: people who once laughed and sweated in these empty sheds, talked community and crop in the shriveling towns, where are they? Implements rusting next to barbed wire. These lines really resonate with me. It has been nearly 55 years since my parents' farm sale. I was 14, my brother 10, and we both chose to go to school that winter day rather than watch as every piece of machinery, every grease gun and spare part, every link of chain and length of rope that my father had accumulated in 12 years of farming was sold at auction. My father was happy with the proceeds that day, and in truth, the total may have come close to 2 years' income for my parents at that time. But to look through the clerk's report of the sale today conjures up an image of stripping the dead. Friends, neighbors, and relatives pick through a man's life, taking what they find useful, battling in their bids on its value, leaving the rest to someone else. Barrels and battery chargers, wrenches and rakes, the manure spreader, the hay loader, all three tractors, even our childhood swing set, everything went. The sale meant the end of a way of life for our family. My father was no longer a farmer, my mother no longer a farm wife, all of us no longer a farm family. Measured in the quality of the house in which we lived and in the amount and reliability of the income my father produced, the move off the farm almost certainly resulted, not immediately but eventually, in a better life. And yet, all of us would one day come to realize that something other than machinery disappeared from our lives that last day of January 1967. At the time, of course, a farm sale and a subsequent move to town were not at all unusual. In fact, what makes my family's experience worth noting at all is the nearly universal nature of it. In 1967 alone, the number of farms in the United States dropped by nearly 90,000, almost 3%. Census reports showed that in the time my father farmed, from 1955 to 1967, the U.S. farm population was nearly cut in half, from more than 19 million to just over 10 million. Behind those statistics showing net change in farm population and maps illustrating population migration patterns lay real people leaving real places. Thomas Jefferson, we all know, envisioned the United States as an agrarian democracy. He thought a nation of free and equal farmers could best protect the rights of individuals, not only from a tyranny of kings, but also from what he termed the heavy and unrestricted hand of powerful industrialists. Jefferson had other ideas too. He wanted to establish a standard design for plows, for example, one that could be used by plow manufacturers everywhere. He did not succeed in designing such a plow, but others who came after him did, creating a uniformity that, ironically, allowed the application of industrialization to the making of plows, and thus to farming. In Jefferson's own lifetime, improvements in the plow, which mostly cut the amount of man and animal labor required to work the soil, helped drop the percentage of the American population that farmed from 90 to 70%. That decline has never stopped. It was more than 100 years ago that Anders Peter Anderson, my great-grandfather, first dropped a plow into the rich ground of Burt County, Nebraska. The county had had a rough start. One of the original counties of Nebraska, it was named for Francis Burt, a South Carolina editor and legislator and auditor of the U.S. Treasury, who had been appointed the first governor of Nebraska Territory. His trip from South Carolina to Nebraska in 1854 included rides in a train car, a stagecoach, a steamboat, and a wagon. and the journey must have been an unpleasant and physically trying one. By the time he got to Bellevue on October 7th, he was exhausted. He rested a week, took the oath of office, and then died 2 days later. Severe drought hit the plains the next year, leaving cracks in the ground in Burt County as wide as 4 inches and as deep as 3 feet. Winter, not wanting to be outdone, roared in early December, the opening storm lasting 6 days and nights and leaving snow 4 feet deep and drifting to 15. What few settlers then lived in the county, and the first census in 1860 counted fewer than 400, were completely cut off from Omaha and Council Bluffs, their only source of supplies. They likely would have starved if the storms accompanying extreme cold had not forced deer, antelope, and elk into the sheltered bottomlands along the Missouri River, which served then, as now, as the eastern boundary of the county. But the land was extremely fertile, not only in the bottoms along the Missouri, but also in the valleys and gently rolling prairie. The soil, a black sandy loam underlaid with clay, was designed, boosters argued, to withstand the extremes of temperature and precipitation. The climate is dry and healthful, they boasted. It is the best in the world. In 1859, a Philadelphia bookseller named Aaron Arlington settled with his wife and 4 daughters on Logan Creek in western Burt County. Arlington and his family stayed only 3 years, though, having suffered all the hardships of a pioneer's life. He sold his land in 1862 to John Oak, who had originally pioneered along the river. The next year, Oak named his small settlement Oakland, and in 1867, the year Nebraska became a state, he became the town's first postmaster. Soon, Oakland added a store in 1870, a preacher in 1875, a doctor in 1877, a lawyer, and a school, both in 1878. By 1880, Olaf Holmquist, my maternal great-great-grandfather, was running a livery and feed stable in Oakland. Within the next decade, Anders Peter Anderson, now on his second trip to America, decided to farm in Nebraska. After first farming near the town of Ord, in March 1908, my great-grandfather, now going by the name of Andrew rather than Anders, settled with his wife and family just east of Oakland. By the time my parents, who had met in high school, married, and spent the Korean War at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, moved back to Oakland in September of 1954, the Holmquist owned grain elevators and lumber yards in nearly 30 Nebraska towns, and our branch of the Andersons had been farming in Burt County for more than 45 years. My grandfather, recently retired, had farmed there. One of my father's brothers farmed there, as did a brother-in-law. Another brother and brother-in-law managed the International Harvester dealership in nearby Lyons. My father prepared to go to ag school here in Lincoln, but his father instead bought him a feedlot full of cattle, and in January 1955 set my parents up on a quarter section east of Oakland. My grandfather, Emil Anderson, wanted all his boys to join him in farming, and it is easy to see why. My grandfather, after some early failures, had retired as a very successful farmer. The president of a livestock commission company in Sioux City, Iowa, once wrote a letter of recommendation for my grandfather when he was trying to rent another man's farm. He and his boys are always home, he wrote, and they know how to work, plan, and go ahead. He concluded by saying, he and his family are the kind of people I would like to have on a farm of mine if I had one to rent. The times, too, if you looked at them in one way, were quite good. Farming in the first half of the 20th century was, for those able to stick with it, an exciting and profitable way of life. In 1929, for example, gross farm income in the U.S. was $13.8 billion, and net income, the portion the farmers could keep for themselves, was 6.8 billion. Farmers on average were keeping 49 cents of every dollar they grossed. The decade of the 1920s especially was a breakthrough period in farm science and technology, where farming at the beginning of the 20th century had relied almost entirely on human and animal power. By the time of World War II, draft animals had been mostly replaced by tractors. This substituting another source of power for animal strength, which the internal combustion tractor certainly did, marked for many the beginning of the true industrialization of agriculture. Where only a handful of gasoline tractors existed in 1900, by 1914 more than 17,000 tractors were at work on America's farms. By 1930, tractors had pneumatic rubber tires, which not only made them more comfortable to ride and easier to move, but also cut fuel consumption by as much as 20%. Manufacturers knew who was buying their tractors. When International Harvester, then selling nearly half the tractors in the nation and the first choice of all the farmers in our family, developed its new Letter Series tractors in 1939, it hired noted industrial designer Raymond Loewy to give the new farmals what the company called a distinctive modern family appearance. Farm equipment manufacturers labored to keep up with developments in the tractor. Early on, most tractors still pulled implements designed to be horse-drawn, restricting the tractors to speeds of no more than 2.5 miles per hour. By 1940, most implements had been redesigned to allow speeds of up to 5 miles an hour. The power takeoff and the power lift became standard equipment at about the same time. With each improvement, farmers could work the land more quickly and efficiently, and these gains brought profound changes to all aspects of rural life. But there was another way to view farming in the first half of the 20th century. Science and technology were delivering to farmers bigger, better, and more expensive equipment. The result, however, was not necessarily better farming, but rather less labor-intensive farming. Each year, the nation needed fewer farmers to work the same amount of land. In the mid-1920s, the distinguished agricultural economist E.G. Nourse summed up the situation cleverly. "The outlook for agricultural production is so good," he wrote, "that the outlook for agricultural prosperity is distinctly bad." By 1920, only 30% of the U.S. population was engaged in farming. By 1940, the proportion had declined to 23%. It was social Darwinism for rural America. By 1955, the year my father began farming, that proportion had dropped to just over 11%. He was starting off in a line of work in which each year fewer people succeeded, in which, as a matter of fact, fewer people were needed. As you are undoubtedly aware, this decline has yet to stop. Today, 1.3% of the country's population farms. Now, it's quite possible that my father, who was then 25 years old, was unaware of these national figures. He might even have been unaware that in his relatively short lifetime, the population of his own county had dropped from its peak of just over 13,000 to less than 11,000. Today, fewer than 7,000 people live in Burt County. Regardless, it was a tough beginning for my father. He started out with two of those letter series farm-styled farmals, an H and an M. Both were four-cylinder, all-purpose tractors, the mid-sized H able to pull a two-bottom plow, and the large-sized M able to pull a three-bottom plow. Both were well-made and popular. Eventually, nearly 400,000 H's and 300,000 M's were produced. The years 1955 and 1956 were hot and dry, and most of my father's corn ended up being cut for silage. In addition, farming with his father and two older brothers, my father chafed at his low spot in the pecking order. Often he found himself spending more time on their farms than on his own. After 2 years of farming with his father and believing he had a better chance at success, which he now defined as owning his own place, he moved us in early 1957 to an irrigated farm west of Oakland owned by my mother's uncle. We were still renters, not owners, and he still had a landlord to consult before decisions could be made. But he now consulted with the landowner as an equal, not as a son. And there, after a fashion, he prospered. 3 years after leaving his father's place, my father was the runner-up in a local outstanding young farmer competition, and he read and studied to stay current with new technologies and methods. International Harvester in 1958 unveiled a new class of tractors, and this time the appeal wasn't to families, but the one the company called a new world of power. My father replaced the H with a diesel 460 with nearly double the horsepower of his other tractors. He added new and bigger equipment to go along with it. In 1962, he bought a third tractor, a Ford 100 series, rated for a three-bottom plow. My father thought I was now old enough to send out alone on a tractor, but not strong enough for the M, which he loved to say came only with Armstrong power steering. For my father, the key selling point of the Ford, for him, but even more for my mother, who thought I was too young at 10 to drive the thing, was that the clutch and brake pedals did not have to be pushed forward, but rather straight down. In an emergency, I could simply stand up on the pedals to stop the tractor. In the early 1960s, low tillage and no tillage methods of field preparation were not yet widespread. Most farmers, including my father, plowed twice a year, spring and fall, and disked and harrowed as well. The goal was a neat, clean, well-tended field before planting, and this meant multiple trips through the field. Buying a tractor I could use doubled our family's labor force, at least for those jobs with which I could be trusted. The next few years were the highlight of my childhood, helping my father in the field, keenly aware that, at least when it came to a certain few jobs, I could now do the work of an adult. This is the farm my brother and I both remember growing up on, the one we think of when we think of being on the farm. My father came to love raising cattle. Though my brother and I were spared any euphemisms for the reason we were feeding the cattle, it was always clear that my father truly liked the animals. He came to especially enjoy the spring with its cycle of planting and growth. When he planted soybeans, he would always put some beans between moistened paper towels in a pie plate on the back porch. Checking them periodically would tell him what stage his beans in the field had reached. He liked to figure, always writing in the margins of the newspaper with his mechanical pencil, parsing, trying to get the numbers to work. His best thinking, he always said, he did on the seat of a tractor, especially the M. In all the time we had the M, it never had a muffler, only a rusted and pockmarked straight pipe that made it the loudest tractor my father owned. I never knew why he ran it that way, and it may simply have been so that when he was in the field with the throttle wide open, he would not have been able to hear an airplane land behind him, a sensory deprivation chamber made just for the farm. His figuring and thinking always led him to the same conclusion. He needed to own his own farm. In the mid-1960s, he found a farm to buy and asked his father to co-sign the note. But my grandfather did not think the numbers worked. Instead, my father rented a larger farm 15 miles south of Oakland, just across the Burt County line, and we moved. But he was a flatland farmer, and the new farm had hills and terraces, and he never cared for it. After 1 year, he and my mother decided to take a chance. At age 37, with neither job nor house to live in, my father decided to call it quits. 20 years later, My father retired as a fertilizer salesman for a large multinational corporation. He had traveled northwestern Nebraska and surrounding states, selling fertilizer by the train car and staying in touch with the people he always seemed to like best, farmers. A burgeoning farm crisis, which was about to include one of my uncles among its victims, had moved out of the pages of Farm Journal and successful farming magazines and onto the big screen. In movies like Country, starring Jessica Lange and Sam Shepard, and The River, starring Mel Gibson and Sissy Spacek, banks and power companies were portrayed as monstrous villains. The good guys, represented by these attractive movie star couples, were the family farmers. At the same time, popular musicians like Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, and Neil Young organized the first Farm Aid concerts to raise money to help struggling farmers pay off mortgages before banks foreclosed. In a time when it was becoming harder and harder to remain one, the family farmer had become a national hero. Was it an agrarian tradition being protected, or was it an agrarian myth being polished? The search for an answer suggests what our family and thousands of others like us gave up by getting out. Marty Strange, then at Nebraska's Center for Rural Affairs, a self-described advocate for family farming, wrote at the time, "Like pornography and patriotism, the term family farm eludes definition." Strange and countless others have gone on, however, to chase down some characteristics of the family farm and the people who work them. And the portrait that is created often suggests lean green farmers that should be in line for sainthood. These family farmers ignore the pettiness of economics for higher values. They keep their resources, whether human, natural, or financial, in optimal combination and work diligently to conserve them because they own them. They respond to the rhythmic quality of the seasons. This characterization clearly echoes the elusive agrarian ideal, first established by Jefferson 200 years earlier and promoted since by many others, a diverse group including Frederick Jackson Turner, Willa Cather, and Wendell Berry. And it works to counter not only the corporate culture that served so conveniently as the enemy in the movies, but also what family farming itself has become. In 1988, Strange announced American agriculture, including the traditional family farm, is becoming industrialized. What he was responding to were changes not outside family farming, but within it, changes that had been set in motion with those first attempts to standardize the plow 2 centuries earlier. Everything that seemed like progress to my father and millions of other farmers like him, every new line of tractor, every additional acre farmed, every change that made working the soil easier or faster, had moved family farming closer to this point. Detractors have long called the family farm tradition a cultural myth, even a romantic one. But Strange argued that even as a myth, the idea of a nation of family farmers had served a useful purpose. I believe he's right. And I believe it is this idea, this vision, this myth even, that we yearn for, those of us who once lived on farms and those of us who never did. The agrarian tradition, of which family farming is a key part, calls for people to be neighborly, to care for future generations, to work hard and to believe in the dignity of work, to be frugal, modest, honest, and responsible for and to the community. The tradition requires us to recognize that at each season of the year arrives a festival of duties that gives pattern to life. Finally, it requires the involvement of the whole family. Children do work that is useful and important to the family, and they are held accountable for failing to live up to their end of the bargain. As a child, when I would come home from school, my father was always there. He was almost always working, but if I couldn't see him, I could hear him, the loud M recognizable a quarter mile away. Once I was 10, I was usually instructed to change my clothes and join him. In town, where my friends' fathers went off to work as mechanics and electricians, as dry cleaners and postmen, none of my friends went along. None of them were required to help. In town, there was no organization for the children of milkmen designed to prepare them for careers as the milkmen of the future, no club for the pharmacist's children or those of the fertilizer salesman. But for farmers' children, two such organizations existed: 4-H, and when you got older, FFA. Once we moved off the farm, I never actually watched my father work again, and I was never required to help him. The same was true with the neighbors. On the farm, my mother and other women in the same situation could get together and discuss the trials and tribulations of what they called having men without worrying they might end up on a show called Desperate Farm Wives. When there was work to do that my father could not handle alone, his brothers, friends, and neighbors showed up to help and to eat with us. Their payment was a promise that he would return the favor. After we left the farm, my father's job did not regularly require anything of him that he could not handle by himself. And if such a circumstance did ever present itself, in his first job at least, he had a paid assistant. On the farm, there were chores to be done every day of the year, no matter what the weather. From a fairly early age, my brother and I had such chores as well. Sometimes it meant wearing insulated coveralls, sometimes 4-buckle boots, sometimes a shirt from which the sleeves had been torn. Sometimes we complained about the cold or the rain, but I don't remember it ever doing any good. Once we moved to town, other than shoveling snow off the driveway or mowing the yard, I never worked outside again. Weather was no longer to be embraced, it was something to avoid. The lessons my brother and I remember learning from our parents often have little to do specifically with farming, but much more to do with the way work in general was done. My father, for example, believed that if a person was going to plant a crop in rows, it was simply right that those rows be straight. The same was true of fences. If it was worth your time to put one up, it was worth your time to make it straight. I do not plant row crops or build fences, but I have relied on the principles that lie beneath these beliefs throughout my working life. In the end, this is what we miss about life on the farm. We miss this all-inclusive creed that we do unto everything, not only our fellow man, but also the very nature of which we are a part, the way we would have done unto us. It turns out that the myth we bought into was not that we should be family farmers forever. The myth we bought into was that we could take the way of life with us when we left. Thank you very much. I would be happy to carry on the conversation or answer questions if anybody has any.
It sounds so idyllic for a city girl like me. It's always striking to me that almost everyone at my church grew up on a farm except me. So,
Well, it probably was much harder work than I'm making it sound. Obviously I'm looking back from quite a distance. Um, but it really was true that it was a family encounter. I mean, you simply were all involved in it, and that was something that my town friends never got to experience, and I'm grateful for having had that opportunity.
Uh, Tim,
Bob.
one of the things that I had the fortune of living in town, but my father farmed a lot of places. Um, One of the things that struck me when I started doing irrigation tours with the university was arriving at an alleged farm that wasn't a farm because it didn't have any animals and it didn't have a farmer's garden even in it.
Yeah,
It didn't have cats. Most of them had a house, but the house was no different than the house in town.
right.
So I don't know when that happened, but I really felt bad when I'd go to a farm and not see anything.
The
But row crops.
Yeah, my parents lived on a farm. My mother was there until just a few years ago, but slowly all the outbuildings, the barn and the corn crib and everything had all caved in, and we eventually tore them down. And my niece would always say, "This is not a real farm.
Right.
This is just a house in the country." And my brother and I still own a farm, and the gentleman who farms it, we figured out several years ago. So it's probably the number's probably grown, but probably 10 years ago, he was farming what supported 12 families when we were in high school. So I mean that's 50 years ago, but still that was, 12 families living off that land, and now two people live off that land. I mean, it has been a dramatic change. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, very, very good. I really appreciate that, your personal uh, experience there in your family. Um, I left Lincoln in 1967 and came back in 1997, so I was gone 30 years. And one thing I noticed about Lincoln when I moved back was all the people that used to be on farms or small towns,
Hmm.
and they're all over the place. And another thing I discovered is especially the farmers really knew how to do a lot of things that I really admired. In other words, they could renovate their houses and they could do everything. Okay? That's because they had to do everything.
Hmm.
And so the high point of farms, if I remember correctly, was 1934 when my mother graduated from high school in Rising City, Nebraska, which is Butler County. And so I am a idiot when it comes to farming, but as a youth, I had many relatives that were in farming and so forth up in Butler County. But I really admired them for the ability to do all these different things that I didn't know how to do. And I think that's remarkable. And one last thing, when all the farmers left, all the small towns emptied out too. So it was not just the farmers, it was all those little towns that were there giving farmers support. And hasn't been a lot written about that. There's been a lot written about the Rust Belt.
Hmm.
But, and I also think that most of the people that farmed and got off farms were successful doing something else.
Right. Well, I know in Oakland when I was in high school, so 50 years ago, there were three car dealerships, two implement dealers, a men's clothing store, two women's clothing store, two drug stores, two grocery stores, and now there's one drugstore and one grocery store, and that's about it.
Yeah, and they're barely making it.
Yeah, they're fortunate in Oakland in that Omaha keeps growing out closer and closer. So you can live in Oakland now and drive 45 minutes to work in Omaha, and increasingly, that's who's moving there. Kendra.
I've always thought that it's one of the great untold stories in Nebraska that one of the ethics of some farm people, at least my family, was that kids can grow up, get with the theory or the um, guidance that you ought to get off the farm. Whatever you do, get off the farm.
Yeah.
That was both my mom and dad grew up on the farm, and they were good farm. Well, my dad's was a good farm in the Platte River bottoms. And there was nothing wrong with the farming life. It was a good farming life, but his family was the strongest in making sure he got off the farm. That's and they also never ever. I mean, they grew up with the notion that you didn't do certain things, you didn't gamble, and you didn't go in debt. But they believed in going in debt for education because it was how you got off the farm.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really strong. I don't know how many farm families in Nebraska had that idea, but very strong in our family.
Yeah, my father never encouraged my brother or me to consider farming. He didn't actively discourage it, but as soon as we expressed interest in doing something else, he and my mother were completely supportive of, yeah, go off and do something else entirely. And but I think, we didn't know when we were kids that my father had planned to go to college rather than farm, and that his father had kind of coerced him into farming, because we never, you know, when we look back on it now, we think, wow, he farmed for 12 years and didn't want to do it. And
Yeah.
we never had any sense of that. There was never any sense that this is not the life I chose for myself. Even though my grandfather wouldn't co-sign the note to buy a farm, there was never any break in our family. I think now, how did we keep, going and seeing him? But we did. Um, the family stayed strong, and everybody in the family and everybody we knew, all my parents' friends, they all farmed, and virtually none of their children farm.
Yeah,
Virtually
I
everyone
never
left.
heard single bit of romanticism about life on the farm. Never, growing up, and that there's a reason that the farms are deserted. There's a reason that the small towns are deserted.
Tim, this is Dean Settle. I have a
Yeah, Dean.
question for you.
Okay.
My family goes.
You're locked up there, Dean.
And we were farming in the Bottoms area, farming, and has found a family friend's son to take over the operation. But one thing that I wanted to ask, my family was really involved politically with Farm Bureau.
Mm-hmm.
And Farm Bureau did some amazing things. A lot of co-ops were developed, unified school districts resulted, and some real focus on better selling, better buying, better transportation for farmers. How about your family, Tim?
They were not involved in Farm Bureau or in NFO, was another big organization back then. I remember once we shipped cattle to Omaha, and I rode with one of the semis into Omaha, and the NFO was kind of harassing truck drivers as they pulled into I forget what the issue was, but they were trying to stop trucks. My dad was never political at all, and I don't know, I don't have any idea what he thought about some of those things. I know there were people in Oakland who were involved in both those organizations, but my dad went on the GI Bill. He drove 7 miles to Lyons one night a week for some sort of agribusiness class. And that was the only thing he did kind of to better his farm knowledge that I know of.
You mentioned the Center for the
Rural Affairs, yeah.
Center for Rural Affairs. What's your I worked for state government when we used to review federal grants, and I reviewed the federal grant for the creation of the Center for Rural Affairs. I sent it out to East Campus to Extension to review it, as we had to do, and they said there's nothing to this, this is just a flash in the pan. I don't agree with that, and I still don't. What do you think of it?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it was helpful. It didn't exist when we farmed. It came after my dad had left the farm, but I think he would have approved. It was, and farmers are an independent bunch of people.
Real farmers.
Yeah, they never really liked to organize. They didn't like to be told what to do.
They didn't want to accept Social Security.
Yeah, they weren't joiners, they just didn't. And I think we see some of that still today, in our state. People who, I can pay for my own medical care, thank you. I don't need any help from the government.
Right.
I want to control of the schools as local as I can make it. And of course, back then, you know, my parents' friends were the parents of my schoolmates, and we went to a one-room country school. So it was all inclusive. I mean, the kids I went to school with, their parents were in the same boat my parents were in, and they shared work and we shared meals, and you know, it felt like a community. You know, I think they would have appreciated some of the research that the Center for Rural Affairs has done. I think they would have appreciated the fact that somebody with that kind of knowledge would have been arguing on their behalf. I mean, I think the Center for Rural Affairs really was on the side of the small farmer. I don't know what they're up to now, but yes, Sandy,
Another factor in rural communities
I'm sorry.
is who owns the land. And in Nebraska, the two largest landowners are Bill Gates and you
Ted
can
Turner.
name the other
Ted
guy.
Turner,
It's Ted Turner.
and the Mormon church is right up there.
Mhm.
Yes, in fact, in my home county in Illinois, the Mormon church is the largest landowner. And at this point, they're hiring people who used to be independent farmers to go ahead and work the land.
Mhm.
But I think the long range worry is that the corporate mindset might not care for the soil like somebody who actually owned it or rented it from somebody who did own it that they
Right.
knew well, like you described.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think we've got a lot to worry about.
Well, and I think, you know, when I was a kid, we grew at least 5 crops every year. Now almost nobody grows anything other than corn and soybeans. And that's all. There's really not much of a market for anything else. I mean, we would have milo and sorghum and wheat and oats, alfalfa, and there was some thought given back then. I mean, I know there still is, but you know, alfalfa put nitrogen back into the ground. So you'd run corn someplace for a couple of years, and then you'd put alfalfa there, and you know, at some point they started doing that with chemicals, and you know, in the people I know in Burt County, it tends to be local people who've just become enormous farmers, like the guy who farms our stuff. They just have, he's a local guy. I mean, I went to high school with him, um, but I'm not sure how different he is from a corporate farmer, frankly.
Wanted to build a little bit on what John was saying. I can remember my a mantra really that my grandfather and then my father would recite at certain times when we would get together, and that is that the role of the farmer is that of being a very smart and good steward.
Right.
And that it was our responsibility, almost like a God-given responsibility, to hand off the property and the animals and the equipment and capitalization around the farm to the next generation in an improved manner.
Right. Yeah, you don't hear anything about stewardship anymore.
It was a lost word, I think.
Yeah, I'm afraid
Lately.
so.
Well,
Sandy,
Yeah, I've got a question.
Sandy, go ahead.
Okay, just real quick. So we're at 1.3%, right, of people that farm in the United States now. And you gave us the percentages as things were dropping, and they were dropping rapidly, obviously, in the 60s. So import and export, was there a presidential administration that was responsible of changing the ratio of import and export? And did that possibly affect some of this as much as the expense of equipment and some of the things that we were selling to expedite farming?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I mean, I know there were periods in farming when you didn't farm fence row to fence row. My
Yeah.
father always said, let us farm fence row to fence row and we can feed the world. Now we kind of do that, and I don't know if that's working, but Jack.
Yeah, I've got something.
Go ahead. I think she wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Did you want to follow up, or?
Oh, you
Yeah,
go
I
ahead,
do.
and I'd love to talk. Sure. Go ahead.
Do you want me to go ahead? Okay. Well, I'm going to sound like one of the bad guys here because my brother and I were Philadelphia Cowboys who came to Nebraska. I came out in 74. My brother actually came out in 60 and then was in the Army for 2 years and then came back. But between his working for American stores and buying cattle for them, we started buying land in Nebraska. And I came out in 74. But over the years, we both kept jobs. He worked for American Stores for 20 years. I taught school and coached football. But in all that time, we were buying land and building a cattle herd. We were in the cow-calf business. So we started out with 140 acres, and we had 18 cows with calves at their side. That's the way we described it. But we always tried to buy land if it touched on our land. And unfortunately, you've described perfectly what was happening with the farmers around us. We were new guys coming in. We had some cash and we had other jobs. And so and my father as well came to Nebraska during that time period. And we sold a farm back east of 30 acres for $75,000, which was a lot of money then and gave us quite a good start in Nebraska. So we first purchased, I think I said 140 acres for $400 an acre. And around us, the farms were being sold. Older gentlemen, many of them with their kids had left the farm.
Yeah.
They were moving into nursing homes, or they were at a point where the property taxes were killing them and they needed to sell. And so we were the bad guys and the good guys, and we never asked for any more for the land than the man asked.
Mhm.
If he whatever he said he wanted to sell his farm, we went to the bank and borrowed money and bought the farm if we could. And so we ended up with 1,800 acres. And that was accumulation of over 7 farms.
Mhm.
And we raised cattle, and we had over 500 head of cattle by the end of that time. But we were working we were working pretty hard because, like I said, we were holding down other jobs, and we were putting all of our time that we had free, putting up barbed wire fences and repairing buildings and doing whatever we could to keep it all going.
Sure.
So, but that's the other chapter. You've told the story of how you get there. And then we came in at the end of your story and really although you feel guilty buying a farm from a guy that, has been doing it for all these years, his family's gone and he's the only guy left. And he comes to you. Many of them came to us and said, we'd like to sell our farm. Are you interested? And if it touched on our land, we tried to buy it. And it was a very different experience from yours.
Yeah.
But our biggest enemy became the property tax. And I was an educator, and so was my wife. And we knew the schools needed the money. But when 70% of your tax money was going to the school, and we were, at this point in our lives, we're paying over $80,000 an acre for 1,400 acres. We sold some land a while back, but I know the farmers around us suffered dearly from property tax, and the state refuses to do anything about it. So I've had a whole different experience than yours, but I really appreciate all the things I'm hearing about, the family farm and the ties that it had. And I felt great sympathy for the people who had to sell and were hurt.
Well, it's interesting. While I worked on this paper, of course, I spent 30 years in the newspaper business. And I realized as I was reading over this paper today, I could probably do almost the same paper on my experience in the newspaper business, which was they were all individually family-owned newspapers. And then slowly they all became owned by Gannett. And then slowly they all went online and all the papers died and all of us got laid off. I mean, agriculture is not the only place where there's been consolidation. I think of my great grandparents raised their family, 2 daughters, on an 80-acre farm. And I suspect we're considered fairly successful. I mean, they had nice things and, were well dressed and well thought of and hardworking. But they were able to do that with 80 acres. Uh, you need at least 10 times that now. Probably 20 times that, really. And it's sad, but I think the thing that I found most in thinking back about it is that there is no stopping. I mean, Jack, what you were doing was a very natural, uh, progression. Uh, every time a piece of property gets sold, somebody wants to sell it, somebody wants to buy it, and they agree on a price. Sometimes people are kind of over a barrel maybe when they have to sell it. They've got debts they need to pay or whatever, but still it takes a buyer and a seller without much coercion to get that to happen. But I think it's my brother is about to retire. He's had a landscaping and lawn service business. So kind of the closest thing that a city dweller can have to a farm life. So he's had trucks and tractors and he's grown flowers and grass, and he always hired young men from farms who were at the university. He would advertise in the Daily Nebraskan, get 20 farm kids, about 20 years of age. They could drive any truck he had. They could drive any piece of equipment he had. They were used to getting up early in the morning. They didn't mind getting dirty. And he can't find those kids anymore. Even farm kids can't drive a standard transmission. Farm kids who haven't driven a large tractor, because it's just not the way the work is anymore. That way of life is just kind of vanished.
I'm kind of convinced that Kawasaki moved to Lincoln because they knew all those farm kids who knew how to weld were were looking for jobs.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a quick question, Tim.
Yeah, Penny. Yeah.
I can't believe you're talking about Oakland. I went to the Nyhart Center yesterday for their lecture, and I can't wait to tell you about meeting the director and all the good words said about you, my friend. And I stopped trying to find a place to eat in Oakland. Godfather's Pizza was it, and it was not great, but that's another matter.
Yeah.
And I wondered about it. Who was there? What was its history? And here I am hearing his paper about it.
Now you know more than you wanted to know.
No. It's so nice to hear a wonderful, fleshed out story. But back to the Center for Rural Affairs. I grew up here and then I moved away for around 40 years and then I came back in 2011. The Center for Rural Affairs, I believe, spearheaded the movement that got a law to be passed by our unicameral forbidding certain kinds of corporate farms from existing or farming in Nebraska. And those of you who've been here all along would know more about that legislation. It didn't last very long. I believe it was repealed after 2 or 3 years. But I guess as I think about what's happening to those who are still surviving, I am still horrified by the fact that the large seed companies own the seeds. Farmers who want so much to be independent, it's just part of their DNA and their traditions, they can't even own their seeds. And of course, they really can't own the equipment anymore because they're in debt to the bank. They're never quite owners in the way that they think they are or would like to be. So 2 questions. One, the Center for Rural Affairs really stuck its neck out, I believe. I don't know when it was, 1988. And some of you would know that history. And second, what do we do about what's happened to those who are still surviving with enormous agribusiness concerns owning the seeds and other parts of the operation?
The thing is, which I tried to get at in this, and I find the same thing true in the newspaper work that I did, is that none of these things happened overnight. It's not like there were 1 million family farms on Friday and on Monday there were 10 family farms left and the rest had all gone corporate. It was a slow, evolution of somebody who had 80 acres, got a chance to buy another 80 and they had 160. And that was better. And their son had a chance to go from 160 to 320, and that was better. And then pretty soon somebody had a section of land, and that was even better. Um, and and that all happened as the technology was such that tractors were getting bigger. You know, we had on the farm that my brother and I still own, there was a little maybe 12-acre patch that had actually been a feed lot at one point. And when we stopped having cattle, it just was put into brome grass for a while, and some guy would come every year and cut it once and bale it. Well, then the guy who farmed our land, when corn prices got high, he asked if he could plant corn there. And we said, sure, that'd be fine. Well, he had a 32-row planter. So planting that 12-acre section with a 32-row planter, half the time he spent in the field was turning the tractor around. He would literally drive through, then spend 30 minutes getting positioned to go back through one more time and be done. So you can farm 4 sections of land now, you know, one guy. And you couldn't do that when my dad was farming. And I think the same thing is with the seed corn. The seed corn companies were always active, and you would drive around, and people were brand loyal. You know, there were Funk's G Hybrid and other names that, you know, just like buying tractors or cars, you were a Chevy family, a Farmall family, and you bought Funk's G Hybrid seed. And that relationship with the seed companies, and that relationship, not many people raise cattle anymore, but those who do feed cattle, it's the same thing. They feed cattle for an organization. You don't have to worry about selling your cattle anymore. They're sold when you get them. It's just a whole different world. I do think, you know, the guy who farms our property and farms these 12 to 15 other farms, other than the fact that he grew up in Oakland, I can't really tell you what the difference is between him and somebody in Pennsylvania who bought Nebraska farmland as an investment. They take the same tax breaks. They cut the same corners. You know, I think Kevin, this guy who farms our stuff, I think he cares about the land, but I think he believes in the chemistry that's being sold. I think he feels like if you follow the rules with the chemicals, you spray at the right time, you put the right thing on your field, you're going to be okay. The yields are through the roof. You know, when I was a kid, if somebody had 100 bushel corn, you know, you just about wanted to give them a trophy. Now that's just nowhere near enough, you know. It's just all been this. It looks fast when you look back at it like I did, but if you live it, I think it's a slow evolution that in some ways is almost uncontrollable.
Well, sorry, go ahead. I just would love to know more about Marty Strange's efforts, if any of you know about that.
Yeah, I don't really know what, I mean, the Center for Rural Affairs, as far as I know, is still there in Lyons.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. They're doing a lot of creative things. Yes.
So I think we're probably still very active and, you know, probably worth our time and energy to help them. Yes,
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, on Center for Rural Affairs, it's doing very well. It's big in energy now, sustainability. At least 4 of my former students work in various parts of it, and I recently did I give to them annually, and I did a fundraising support thing for it. It's very good. And one answer to Penny's one thing, the Farmers Union, which is quite different than the Farm Bureau. The Farmers Union was very instrumental, but I would differ from you a little bit in that with this sort of slow movement that took place. There have on occasion been dramatic things happen within society that have pushed, I think, what we have today as an agricultural thing. One of them obviously was the Depression and the drought. Another was in the 80s, the tremendous, and I don't know as much about it as I should, but the tremendous economic thing that forced literally hundreds of farmers to sell their land, because I worked with the Center for Rural Affairs. Then we tried to do a couple big conferences on this loss of land, and brought in lots of farm families, a lot of them from around Oakdale, because the center, of course, is in Lyons.
Right.
But there have been some things that have happened that really accelerated it for a period. The farm crisis allowed, people with money to move in and take advantage.
Right. Well, I know in the 80s, just in the people in my family who were affected by the farm crisis had land that they had not had to purchase. This was land my grandfather had, which he bequeathed to his sons. So they'd never had to buy it, but they borrowed against it to buy bigger and better equipment. And then grain prices went south and they couldn't meet their debt payments on equipment. And they just got deeper and deeper into trouble and couldn't find a way out. My father took over my uncle's farm and went to the bank and said, I can't make any payment on the principal, but I'll pay the interest. And the bank, which had already foreclosed on several farms, said, good enough, we'll take that just because we don't want another farm, don't want to own another farm. And in a very short order, my dad was able to turn it around and pay it off. And that's the farm that we still have now. But I think there were farmers who were trying to use economic tools that they hadn't used before. And, I don't know all the details of it, but it was a pretty bad period for a while, the 80s.
Well, and banks were doing things that, and land values went way down too. And that was another option for people to buy land.
Yeah. Again, one of the things that has helped Burke County is that as Omaha has expanded out into rural, the areas around Omaha, developers will buy Omaha area farmland for exorbitant rates. So a farmer who's been farming adjacent to Omaha and has a lot of money, he can come up to Burke County and outbid a Burke County farmer who wants to expand, and it drives prices up. So the prices up there are tremendous.
Yeah.
But
When
thank you, everybody. Yeah. Yes.
I'm from Michigan, and one of this process was very similar in that the Amish farmers, there's a great concentration of Amish farmers in that central Michigan area. And they kind of did the same thing. They had land in Indiana. And when the land in Indiana became very, very expensive, then they moved to Michigan, and where they could buy land that was a little less expensive, and are still farming. I mean, there's any number of Amish farm, and they seem to make it work for whatever reason.
Well, and I'm sure they hold their costs down too by not buying big, expensive tractors and equipment, and a lot of fuel and all of that. So,
well, they must have an amazing economic concepts, because in Pawnee County, 20 or 30 years ago, a huge group of Amish moved in and were there 10 years and then left, sold everything and left. And now about 4 or 5 years ago, either the same group or another group came in and bought up a huge amount of land. One of the things, they can farm on small pastures, and they can farm at a different scale. And of course, they have a family connectivity that you enjoy in an informal sense, but theirs is formal.
right. Yeah, I wish I had been more aware of what we had when I was a kid. The neighbors coming over and helping, and us going over and helping neighbors and feeding one another. And when I got to be like 12 years old, my dad would arrange for me to go farm, help some neighbor for pay. I might get $6 for a day's work, doing something. And I thought it was great. I was just as happy as I could be. But I don't know that I fully appreciated the community that I was a part of at that time.
I
You
think
know,
one of the
there's-
profound things you said tonight, Tim, that's really going to get me thinking, maybe all of us. After my father left farming, you said, my father's job did not require anything he could not handle himself. That was a brilliant comment. We're so much more individualistic than we have been in our history. Many believe, many sociologists write about that, and that may be part of it. You know, he can handle it all himself. He doesn't have to keep a community going with his family or his neighbors or the town of or the town of Oakland or the county of Burt. So that was a profound comment that you made.
Well, I don't think the farmers now in the small towns are very individualistic. So when it comes to politics, it's pretty much groupthink. And it's a real phenomenon. What has happened to rural Nebraska and rural America? It is so different than what it used to be. Just to think that people who are flying so close to the ground and have these values instilled in them through church or whatever, neighborliness, are worshiping a con artist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a paradox.
Yeah. So there's a
But-
difference there.
One other quick story though that I love. Iowa Interfaith Power and Light has a farmer as its director. He organized groups of farmers to come to church basements, and they were asked 2 questions to start. How do you encounter God as you farm? How could you really use all that you know as a farmer to deal with climate change? Nobody was invited who thought climate change was hooey. Everybody needed to come who knew it was real. And these guys proposed the idea that made its way to Grassley and a variety of other places to get into the hierarchy, to actually give farmers money for using good carbon sequestration processes on their land, to pay them for doing it. That guy, who's executive director, invited every Democratic candidate to his farm. They all came, and Buttigieg and the guy from Texas, Beto O'Rourke, talked about those ideas. I almost fell off my chair. Joe Biden, our president, also talked about them as part of his giant bill. It's going, wandering through the Congress. I was amazed. So that was really a story of hope for me, that my gosh, farmers can still do a lot.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, Don. Don, you're muted.
We can't hear you.
Don, you have to turn your mute off.
Oh, okay.
There you
Well,
go.
this is a huge topic. We could easily have another whole program on this, but it's been a good discussion. So I thank you for your presentation, and maybe somebody else would like to do a farm program. My farm experiences go way back to my grandparents, so I can't contribute a whole lot in the current scene. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank
I'm
you.
running out of batteries, so I'm going to have to depart here.
I think we've
Thank you,
probably
Tim.
gone
It
on long
was
enough.
great.
Thank you, everybody.
I think Wayne had something. Did Wayne have something to say? I thought Wayne was
did you have a
trying to
question?
talk. Did he? I think he's muted too.
Yeah, you're muted, Wayne, if you're talking.
Wayne, we can't hear you, Wayne. Okay. I think we're done. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, Tim, great, thanks.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you.
Excellent. Wonderful, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Hello.